Look at all these slave masters posing on your dollar.
Public schools would be much better if they had competition. That is why I advocate for money following the child and school choice. How many of you have heard this argument or something very similar? On its face, it's common sense. Public schools are immune to competition since they're publicly funded, meaning there's no incentive for schools to perform well. However, just like any common sense claim, when you dive into the complexity of the issues, it just isn't true. Public schools are completely funded through competition, even without the existence of private institutions. Let's dive into school funding. Part 1. How are schools funded? So, how are public schools funded? According to a paper by the Association for Supervision and Curriculum Development, ASCD for short, public school funding in the United States comes from federal, state, and local sources. But because nearly half of those funds come from local property taxes, the system generates large funding differences between wealthy and impoverished communities. Such differences exist among states, among school districts within each state, and even among schools within specific districts. Federal funding. From newamerica.org, primary and secondary school funding by the federal government is done through discretionary funding, meaning that it is set annually by Congress. The majority of that money is provided through the Department of Education through two main sources: No Child Left Behind Title I grants to local school districts, about $14.4 billion in 2014, and IDEA Special Education State grants, about $11.5 billion in 2014. Federal education funding is distributed to states and school districts through a variety of formula and competitive grant programs. While the federal government contributes about 12% of direct funding for elementary and secondary schools nationally, the amount varies considerably from state to state. In some states, the federal share of total elementary and secondary education spending is less than 5% of the total, while in other states it is higher than 16%. State funding. Most states provide a base amount of funding per student. Some states will provide more funding per student in poverty versus those that are not. However, this funding is dependent on what state legislation passes. That means salary of teachers is tied to how many students are in a district. Some states cover the bare minimum while others spend over $10,000 a student, but all states contribute at least something towards the cost of public education. Local funding. This is where most of the difference in funding is. Property taxes fund this portion specifically. All states use some form of property tax to provide funding for education. There are three major models used to collect these taxes. The first is through foundation grants. Under this model, the state decides the minimum amount that should be spent per student, calculates each district's ability to pay, and fills in the gap. The second is called power equalization. This approach allows each district to tax and spend as if it had the same local property tax base, thereby eliminating the inequities that foundation funding can produce. The last is a centralized model. Rather than trying to outspend the rich districts or equalize property values, some states have essentially centralized their school finance system. The state assigns a standard property tax rate for all districts, and in return, it guarantees roughly the same per student amount across districts. Part 2. Where's the competition? Now that we know where school districts get their money, let's talk about where competition exists on many different levels. Let's begin with the largest entity and move towards the smallest. So, where does competition exist when it comes to federal funding? We already know that not all states receive the same amount of funding as others. One reason is because the criteria of the biggest grant programs. The No Child Left Behind Act was supposed to be distributing and targeting resources sufficiency to make a difference to local educational agencies and schools where needs are greatest, to ensure that all children have a fair, equal, and significant opportunity to obtain a high-quality education. Basically, low-income students would have to be subsidized by federal dollars. A report from the National Education Agency, which I can no longer find because every link on the NEA page about the NCLB is now gone for some odd reason, concluded that Title I's two-stage funding process, in which funds go first to districts, then are sub-allocated to schools within each district, results in low-poverty schools receiving more funding per low-income student than high-poverty schools located in the highest poverty districts. Additionally, federal Title I aid would have to more than double its urbanized states with relatively high student proficiency rates, such as New York, and increase 5 to 10 times in states with low proficiency rates, Missouri and California, to meet even a 90-degree proficiency target. IDEA special education state grants are used solely for the purpose of providing FAPE to children with disabilities. Permitted expenditures include the salaries of special education teachers and costs associated with related services personnel, such as speech therapists and psychologists. States may use funds reserved for other state-level activities for a variety of specified activities, including support and direct services, technical assistance and personnel preparation, assisting LEAs in providing positive behavioral interventions and supports, and improving the use of technology in the classroom. So, states receive funding from the federal government based upon the poverty level of their students and the number of kids with special needs. The No Child Left Behind Act grant helps reduce the inequality of poor and less affluent areas with low property value and property income tax, or tax income. While the IDEA grants help offset the extra costs associated with children who have special needs. They are both meant to supplement failures in funding of the states. In both areas, competition exists, and it exists for completely valid reasons. Winning in this area isn't necessarily a good thing, though. Having more children in poverty means states will get more federal funds, and having more children with special needs means a state will receive more funds from the IDEA grants. Both grants address the failure of the way we fund schools more importantly. This is further shown by the 60 to 70% of the grants being used was for teacher salaries and instructional equipment. Basically, we're subsidizing poor areas. This normally isn't a problem if everything was equal, but it's not. Another form of competition is introduced here, the competition between states, school districts, cities, and all other types of government. A lot of these problems are man-made. What I mean is that the policies of a city within a county within a state are all developed and voted on by people in those districts. So when a city has poor management that is coupled with poor county management and then poor state management, we end up subsidizing those areas with federal money to keep those children from falling into more poverty. We subsidize the poor choices of those places to make sure that the children have the best chance possible. This isn't that bad, but when the same entities talk about how well their areas are doing, even though they are heavily subsidized federally, people think their policies work. This is why many red states take the most in welfare and federal tax dollars, but keep voting in the same policies over and over. The federal subsidization keeps them from feeling the consequences of their ideology. Let's explore this deeper. Each state is competing with every other state for resources. One of the biggest resources is bodies that can produce tax income. So the more working people one has in their area, the more money they can pull in from taxation. And more interesting, the census is also conducted every 10 years. So states also compete for representation in the House. The more people a state has, the more representation that they have at the national table. This competition flows downwards and touches every bit of life for the citizens of that state. Citizens then become tribalized to their state. The biggest example of this is Texas. Texans have this mindset that they are somehow superior to the rest of the United States. I live in Texas. That's because they have so many people living in their state and how well off they are. This is evidence of their superior way of life. But is it really? Texas likes to say they have a huge rainy day fund and that the state pretty much operates a balanced budget. The reason why they have so much extra money is the state takes less of the burden of the citizens and makes each individual city take on more debt. So cities in Texas have a higher amount of debt than states that take on more of that share. According to Truth in Accounting State of the States 2019, Texas needs $98.7 billion to pay its bills. Most of this debt comes from unfunded state pensions and employee health benefits. One of Texas's major problems is, just like Venezuela, much of its economy relies on the oil industry. So when oil isn't doing well, neither is Texas. Texas has been ranked a D in its financial grade and is 33 out of the 50 states. Go Texas. Locally, cities also compete for resources. One of the prime examples of this is when a big business is looking to build a new headquarters or factory. States and cities go nuts over trying to attract these businesses. Take the recent Tesla factory announcement in Austin. Many of these large companies had cities bid for their new projects. These bids included tax rebates and other incentives to attract these companies. Texas boasts having the best environment for business with their low corporate tax rate and right-to-work laws. Tesla plans on building a $1 billion factory with at least 5,000 jobs to start. These jobs will pay at least $15 an hour and have benefits. So how does this all relate to school funding? Well, guess where those tax rebates came from? According to the Austin American-Statesman, Travis County commissioners voted to approve tax breaks for Tesla valued at a minimum of $14 million over 10 years, and the DeVal School District approved just over $46 million in property tax breaks for the company over 10 years. And while the deal did make sure some minimum bars were set, like workers' wages and a guaranteed investment amount into the community, property tax rates that fund local districts were rebated. In Texas, we have the Robin Hood program, where excess money in some school districts is then redistributed to other poorer districts in the state. So when DeVal may not lose much by offering those rebates, other areas in the state might. I also acknowledge that this is going to create a lot of new jobs and bring new people that will buy housing or rent. But not everyone will benefit evenly from these projects. Elon Musk will extract millions of dollars of capital from the local economy for his operations. Tesla will pay no state income tax because Texas doesn't have an income tax. So taxpayers will foot the bill for all the things Tesla uses that the state ends up paying for down the road, like pollution and resources. But to my point, all these layers of competition ultimately affect school funding. If your local community is dirt poor and can't attract big money, then their school districts won't have much money for schools. The policies of the state, county, and city all play into this. These are factors that we can control. Now, there are some factors we can't control, like geography or weather. Some places just have crappy infrastructure, or land isn't that advantageous to develop capital no matter what policies are at play. No one's going to build a $1 billion factory in the desert, except for the city of Las Vegas, but that will fail soon enough because of the water crisis. By default, some areas of the country already have huge advantages over others, so where you live will undoubtedly give you better access to education. 3. Even school districts compete. Yes, there is even competition in school districts. I know, it's hard to believe since there's no profit motive, but profit isn't the only thing that can drive competition, my friends. You can look at any city and see what I'm talking about. There's always that one school district that every parent wishes their children were a part of, but usually can't because the school district encompasses property that are out of their income bracket. In that same city, there's always a school district that no one wants to be a part of. But those children really don't have a choice. These are usually the poorest performing school districts that are severely underfunded and filled with children from the lowest income levels. See, the pool of children in which a school district pulls from affects the overall performance and funding a school has. A school district of mostly white and highly affluent children will probably be one of the highest performing schools in the state, while a school of mostly minorities from lower incomes will struggle to meet many of the national testing standards. Is this because white people are just genetically better and minorities are inferior? No, not at all. It just so happens that the way we fund our schools perpetuates this problem. How? Voluntary segregation. Now, just because the Civil Rights Acts passed doesn't mean that we somehow lost all of our biases and prejudices. We can see this in our school systems. The fact that we have the freedom to move and change districts whenever we want to plays into this. Let's set up an example. A city has one school district and one neighborhood. The school is funded through property tax. Everybody lives within the proximity of each other. The rich kids and the poor kids have ample interactions with each other. This also applies to their families. The environment of the school that it pulls from is varying between income levels, race, and social status. A couple of developers come in and start building neighborhoods. They build a couple middle income neighborhoods and a few higher level income neighborhoods. So the supply of housing brings more people into the city. With that, some of the original people in the neighborhoods move out into the new ones for varying reasons. None of them are based solely on racism. Maybe they moved because they wanted a nicer home, or they wanted a higher property values for a better investment. The people left behind don't have the opportunity to move due to income and credit. More lower class people move in to buy the vacant home since the property value remains the lowest in the city. With the influx of people, the city needs to build a new school to handle the demand. So they build a new school and create a new district. The more affluent children live around the new school already. The new school district pulls in half of the other district's children while the other half remain. Since the higher income homes have more land between them, thus less housing per acre, the class sizes are also smaller than the other school. The older school needs a lot of maintenance and doesn't have all the new bells and whistles that the new school has. So what this does is after a couple years, parents realize that the newer school would give their children a better environment that will lead them to success. So some of them move into the newer district, pulling more resources out of the older school. Not just money either, but also the positive influences they learn from their families and better test results, which leads to a higher demand of the property around the school. The older school's test scores then begin to drop significantly, while the newer school has scores that excel the standard. As the city begins to grow more and evolve, it attracts bigger businesses with higher paying jobs. The parents in the lower income classes don't meet the requirements for these new jobs and are stuck working lower end jobs. More and more people move into the city, more and more schools are built, more and more resources are extracted out of the first school district. Eventually, that school becomes the worst performing district. This in return keeps people from buying property in that area. So the property values don't rise as fast and the property tax collected never really changes and even drops. I can keep going on, but hopefully you get the gist of what I'm trying to say. These poor performing schools are not birthed from a shitty education system, but of the system of funding we've built. With competition on various levels, those that can't compete are just thrown the leftovers. They're grateful to even have free schooling. We've constructed a system that allows voluntary segregation, and then we blame the education system for its failing instead of the real culprits, which is us. In our rational self-interest of wanting to make sure our children have the best possible chance for success, in doing so, we take our resources and place them in areas that end up hurting those most vulnerable around us in the long run. The way we fund schools in this country creates the problems with our education system and the overall success of America. If all children had the resources that they needed to be successful, America would be a better place overall. But right now, only those that can afford it will have the best outcomes, and those that are just along for the ride will have a finger pointed at them for the rest of their lives for growing up in an environment that they had no control over. They will continue to fill our jails. They will continue to have financial problems. They will continue to be stuck in the same place their families have been for generations. This isn't a you problem. This is an us problem. It's a problem that we created, maybe not intentionally, but it is still a problem that we need to solve. We need to find a way to make sure all students in this country have the same outcomes as any other student. It's imperative for our democracy and the continuance of this country. Thanks for listening, guys. If you liked the video, please like, share, and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter. I engage a lot on Twitter, so if you want to have a conversation with me, I am always open to that. I do have a Discord, don't really use it much, but nobody's really asked about it anyways. But hopefully you guys are staying safe, and just keep up the fight. Thanks, y'all.